the inception of video games as a medium and art form incorporated changes to digital media that hadn't been seen before. The unique elements of video games set the medium apart in a plethora of ways from its contemporaries. The primary way, of course, being the ability for the player to control the medium as an active participant as opposed to merely an engaging observer. Throughout the course of video game history, the advancements have served to display a variety of new styles of games, as well as offering unique experiences to the player while emphasizing greater and greater levels of control for the player to utilize. In many games that you'll play, your character typically moves around to accomplish a specific goal, whether that's hitting another character, traveling from one location to another, or obtaining an item. In games like these, your movement is the key to how your character interacts with the world, engine, and surrounding characters. This movement can vary from incredibly simple tile-based movements like in Pokemon, to more advanced and complicated movements like those of FPS games in a fully three-dimensional space. Precision absolutely becomes more important with the latter type of game, and that is where key points of control and responsiveness come into play. Now, obviously different genres of games focus on different things. In RPGs, movement is significantly less important than other aspects of the game, especially during combat, which often consists of turn-based battles that require strategic planning or calculation. When compared to things like platform fighting games or fast-paced first-person shooters whose movement is essentially the key to hitting your opponent and to avoid being hit. Movement isn't important in every game. So for this video, I'm going to be focusing on games where movement or combat is the focal point of the player's interaction with the world. Restrictive movement in a video game is one of the most frustrating and painstaking things to deal with in a game for me, and it's one of the things that makes me stop playing a game. This can be anything from slow run speed on a character to large amounts of startup on a specific action. These movement restrictions can come in many forms. Now, I personally don't really enjoy Monster Hunter, and I may lose some of you here, but hear me out. Out of the most common complaints regarding Monster Hunter is its slow movement and attack startup, grind system, and difficult boss fights. The Monster Hunter franchise is incredibly challenging and is often revered for this, which is not a bad thing at all. A challenge is awesome to have in a game, essential in fact in most cases. It offers something to overcome, defeat, and feel as though you've accomplished something. It gives you a goal. But for me, the challenge that's presented in the Monster Hunter franchise isn't one that's just against the opponent, but it's one that's against the engine as well. You have to fight against the slow movements of your characters, having to take time away from combat to sharpen your weapons, cook food to restore energy, lengthy animations to get up after being knocked down, etc., etc. All in the middle of combat, mind you. To me, it felt as though the game was wasting my time with tedious and slow mechanics just for the sake of making the game more difficult or realistic. The problem is that this isn't done through execution. It's done through monotonous tasks or mandatory waiting periods. And style obviously is something unique to an individual game, and many people really love that about Monster Hunter, hence its incredibly high sales and reviews. This is not inherently a bad thing, but it conflicts with my personal enjoyment of gameplay, which is to give the player good movement and a really high level of control over your character when it comes to combat or interacting with obstacles. Monster Hunter doesn't really do this. The level of control that you have over your character felt arbitrarily restricted by long startup frames, recovery frames, and tedious mechanics that hamper the player's freedom down to a delayed and slow-paced grind. I think that they're excellently made games, artistically beautiful, but just not for me. Now let's take a look at a game that incorporates movement and control exceptionally well. Let's look at Hollow Knight, which is one of my favorite games of all time. Hollow Knight is impeccable for a lot of reasons, but one thing that makes it really good and I think distinguishes it from its peers is its movement. You have an incredibly high amount of control over your character in Hollow Knight, and the controls themselves are very responsive to the input of the player. It allows for minute movements to dodge precision attacks and at a rapid pace, no less. It feels like it does exactly what you want it to, right when you tell it to. It's an amazing combination of fluidity and options given to the player that truly make just moving around this game feel like a real joy. The game is hard too, and it manages to be a challenge for the player, not by restricting the control that the player has over their own character by slowing them down or forcing them to halt all momentum to perform a task, but by making the opponents match that same level of control and speed, to which you as the player have to react quickly to maneuver around them and dodge their attacks. If there is anything to be taken away from this video, it's this statement here. Limiting the player, to me, is almost always the worst option that you can have to go about creating challenge in a game, and Hollow Knight does an excellent job of not limiting the player. Games like Cuphead, Celeste, Hades, Katana Zero, all of these games are noteworthy, not just because they're excellent or difficult titles, which they are, mind you, but because they offer the player exceptional levels of movement and control in tandem with a challenging and exciting experience. 2D games tend to do this really well, and I think may have an easier time than 3D games in some capacity, though there are 3D games that can capture a pretty exceptional level of movement in their own capacity without being restrictive. CSGO has some great options for mobility and control, and the precision that's offered in tandem with that have really been what makes that scene so competitive even after all this time. I think that a lot of FPS games have begun to really enhance the mobility of the player, and as much as I dislike a lot of things about Fortnite, I have to say that the movement is honestly pretty good. This isn't just limited to FPS games either. Sly Cooper comes to mind here. Albeit an older title, specifically when playing as Sly, you're capable of rapidly jumping, landing on precise points with a single button press, and quickly being able to jump and move to another point without missing a beat. And I think that it captures that quick rooftop climbing and thieving type of gameplay that other games like Assassin's Creed can struggle with at times. It's very simple gameplay and does have a very cartoonish art style, but Sly 2 was one of PS2's greatest hits for a reason. And that's one thing about Sly Cooper that's so great. It gives the player an excellent amount of control over their character with simple gameplay and controls. Just moving around the world feels really good. It's not perfect, mind you, and certainly does have flaws, but this is one element that it does really well. Batman Arkham Asylum does this pretty well also, by giving the players a pretty good array of movement options from running to climbing to gliding to grappling. It makes traversing the game world feel incredibly enjoyable to do and really liberating in terms of how unmitigated your movement is. It's a very freeing game despite your occasionally limited scope of area to traverse. I think Spider-Man for PS4 perfected this movement style. You have the ability to climb on walls, sprint across rooftops, and soar through New York City with virtually unlimited amounts of ways to get wherever you're going. It's just pure freedom. The opening scene of this game, while really good from a narrative and aesthetic standpoint, is also amazing at showing you how free the movement is and how much liberty you can take with web swinging and getting from one place to another. It's one of my absolute favorite moments in gaming in general, and this scene really just absorbed all of the good elements of this game and made it pop. It's very telling in a game when just traversing through the world with tools given to you is arguably the most enjoyable part about it. When you press a button in a game, any game, you want the game to perform the action that you want it to when you press that button. If you're playing Call of Duty, you don't want to press the fire button and have your bullet be fired 120 frames later, because you'd miss. Obviously, you can't have everything be a frame 1 option for a character, because that would be insane and you'd have to adjust startup or end lag based on the power or weight of an attack, of course. But making every attack be incredibly slow is also not a very enjoyable alternative. Speed isn't the only thing that matters either. Responsivity, fluidity, directional changes, character acceleration, all of these come together to create good movement in gameplay. It's excellent in Hollow Knight, and it's why things like dash dancing in platform fighters are ways to offer better control over your character. It's why characters like Fox are so much fun to play for a lot of people in Smash. He's fluid, fast, has insanely great mobility, quick frame data, and has a huge amount of custom combos and conversions. He's what every character aspires to in terms of mobility. Why do you think people like Melee so much? The technical skill and movement options that you have to move and control your character make it incredibly fun to watch and to play. It's a great game, and it's why games like Brawl weren't as successful, thanks to the slower, clunkier movement and restrictive options that were presented with the changes to the game's engine. Movement is incredibly important in fighting games as a whole. It's the key way that a player interacts with the game's engine and frequently is a defining factor in whether or not a person likes the game or it feels fluid to them. That's one thing that's good about having characters that have different movement capabilities in fighting games. It offers the player a chance to use a character that fits their desired movement type or flow. In traditional fighting games, however, your movement is significantly limited. Movement is important, but the focal point lies more on poking, playing footsies until you get close enough to dish out a combo string or pin your opponent into a disadvantageous position. In platform fighters, however, the depth of the gameplay typically comes in the form of movement to offer you better control over the positioning of your character. The platform fighter genre truly revolves around movement and your positioning around your opponent to be effective as opposed to extensive combo conversions and input commands. Platform fighters simplify the gameplay considerably in terms of inputs in most cases, and allow the player to create new strings and options using their ability to maneuver effectively. It has significantly better movement than traditional fighters, which is one of the key advantages that they have over them, in my opinion. This is also what makes characters that are highly mobile in platform fighters typically better than other slower or less mobile members of the cast. Platform fighters offer more freedom than traditional fighters do, and that's something that's important to me to feel in a game. I want to feel really in control of my character, and in games like traditional fighters, I just don't. I feel limited by the engine, execution, and how slow certain options are, and how limited my range of movement is through jumping and run speeds. There are many great fighting games out there, and I'm not saying any of this to take away from them in any way. I'm strictly talking about what each type of game focuses on from a design perspective, how that impacts the interactions that the player has with it, and my personal opinion on why I think freedom of movement makes that particular design element more enjoyable. I think that movement is the absolute most important aspect of gameplay, primarily in games where movement is the core focus of how your character interacts with the world, and especially in ones that focus on combat. It's a vital component to making a game feel fluid and fun without making the player feel like a single button press is a 30-second time commitment. When done well, it can create a symphonic and magical experience for the player that keeps them coming back for that feedback loop that provides them a unique gameplay experience and makes them really feel like they are a fully fleshed out entity within the game world. It's truly a great way to convey freedom to the player and to give them an incredible experience that they likely won't forget for a long time. This has been Cobalt. Thank you for watching.